Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Matthew Andrew. Matthew, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate that.
Thank you for taking the time to come on. We're going to be talking about talent identification, talent identity in girls football, girls soccer predominantly. But I'm sure we can think about talent identification, talent development across all sports as well. But before we get on to that topic, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your work.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Appreciate the opportunity to come on your podcast. So, I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University. That's my current role. I guess stepping backwards, probably start at my undergraduate degree. That's where it kind of the love for sports psychology started. Like most people, love for sport, really wanted to study it. So I did my BSc in sport and exercise science at Liverpool John Moores University, with the aims and ambitions of becoming a PE teacher at secondary school. So because of that, I did what most people do, and I sampled absolutely every discipline that I possibly could. And while I was doing that, the one thing that drew me most interest was skill acquisition. Because I wanted to be a PE teacher, I wanted to understand how do infants, how do young people, but then also how do athletes acquire new skills, sport-specific skills or general skills. And for me, I thought that would be a good place to be, given that, I wanted to be a PE teacher and therefore it would help my practice. So that's where I started. And therefore, I did my undergraduate dissertation, observational learning, with Dr. Spencer Hayes, who's now at University College London. And I mention him because he was quite a pivotal role in me being where I am right now. Because when I graduated, I really, really enjoyed the research. I spoke to him at length between finishing up my undergraduate degree and said, I'd love to pursue this further. And he offered me the kind of idea of a master's in philosophy, and it was self-funded. So I did that part-time in between gaining some experience in the PE world and in the high school, teaching world, which was great. So we worked together. I then went off I stayed at Liverpool John Moores University, but a different department, and did my teaching degree, which was great. Really nice to put into practice everything I'd learned over the last, few years into practice and see that come to fruition was really nice. And then towards the end of that led to my PhD. So Spencer asked me if I'd be interested in a PhD that he was looking to put out for advertisement, and just made me aware of it. And it would mean that I would be supervised by the same team that supervised me throughout my undergraduate and masters, which was obviously Spencer, Professor Simon Bennett, who's still at Liverpool John Moores University, and Professor Digby Elliott, who was at Liverpool John Moores at the time, but then also at McMaster University in Canada. So I kind of felt like I couldn't really turn that opportunity down, because I knew that in terms of doing a PhD, it's an apprenticeship in research, right? And I knew that those three particular people would absolutely get the most out of me. The PhD is where it gets a little bit different. I know that everyone's pathways to where they are very different, but this is where mine gets slightly, I would say, non-traditional. I wasn't in sport, so I examined imitation. So it was a long skill acquisition. How do we learn new skills? But it was in autistic adults. So we examined imitation of biological motion in autistic adults. So it was still using the same techniques as we would typically see in sport and exercise sciences, but applying that over to more of a clinical background. And it was really, really, really enjoyable in terms of the work that we did. We worked with a local autistic community in terms of data collection, etc., but also in the design and implementation of some of our interventions. So it's just really nice and give me a really good opportunity to say, okay, how can we work with you? How can we provide you with information that will help you? And they also helped us in terms of almost like pilot testing and understanding the logistics. How many trials of this particular task, how could we set it up so it would be more beneficial for them? So that was great. And so I did that with my PhD, and towards the end of my PhD, I got the opportunity to get back into sport. So one of my, I work with him quite a lot, Dr. Paul Ford, who's at St Mary's in Twickenham at the moment. So Paul was moving away from Liverpool John Moores University, and his teaching in skill acquisition, in particularly soccer, football, came up again.
A legend in that area.
Absolutely, yes. Big shoes to fill. So his teaching came up again. Jumped at that to stay at Liverpool John Moores, and then kind of gradually grew. Started from a 0.5 to a 0.8 to a 0.9, a full time position from 2019. So yeah, that's kind of where I got to. Started exploring talent ID and development as that's what I was teaching, and skill acquisition. Naturally, with Liverpool John Moores University and the strong ties they have to football, it led me down that path. Obviously, being that's my sport anyway was great to do that. And then in 2022 moved across to Manchester. So I guess that's a brief overview of my career so far.
Just before we get on to talent development in female soccer, just pausing briefly on your PhD, really interesting imitation, and as you say, in non-sporting populations. But the first thing I wrote down there, and I don't know if I've done so in my naivety, but makes me think of Albert Bandura's social learning theory, or it makes me think of the Italian neuroscientist Giacomo Ritolazzi, who discovered mirror neurons. Do any of those, social learning theory, Albert Bandura, mirror neurons, did they play quite a big part in your investigations?
Absolutely, yeah. So my external examiner for my PhD was actually Justin Williams, who obviously posited the broken mirror theory.
Oh, what's that? What's that?
It was essentially that in terms of, it was one of the early posits of why autistic individuals had difficulties in imitating actions was because the mirror neuron system was broken. Gotcha. So Justin's work was around the early 2000s. So two of the main review articles were 2001 and 2004. And so slowly, as the research gathered and the research interest in autistic individuals grew, that theory almost wasn't disproven as such, but was kind of, people were adding more and more to it, and the theories gradually grew. So yeah, really interesting fiber. So yeah, it took me down different paths in that respect, around the theory of how we learn and how we acquire skills, and obviously that links really nicely to the social aspects. So yeah, it gave me a really nice different angle to learn, and I took a lot from that in terms of, as I said, working with these individuals, but also broadened my understanding of how we acquire skills, not just from a sport specific context, but also a wider population. So it made me realize that some of the work we were doing, although it's focused in, particularly in sport, there is that wider scope and the wider, lens. And as I've moved around in my career, I think that understanding has allowed me to work in different disciplines as well. So, I've had a prof doc student who has recently passed his oral viva, and he's a sports scientist working with physical data. But what we did is we utilized some of the skill acquisition principles around feedback in order to improve the feedback of data that's collected via global positioning systems. So this is physical data, but we use skill acquisition principles in order to feed that back effectively. So it's just kind of give me that broader horizon of how skill acquisition and understanding how we learn can move just beyond not just soccer, but also sports science and into those wider contexts. So yeah, it's been great.
As a sports psychology consultant, I use imitation or modelling, if you like, all the time in my practice. Only last night, and I'd be keen to get your thoughts on this, because it does venture into the psychosocial realms away from, I suppose, the motor control and motor development side of things. Speaking to a very young player last night who actually has limited English, he's a goalkeeper, he's a very young goalkeeper, and actually just by getting him to pick three model players, I think he picked Neuer, Casillas, Manuel Neuer, Iker Casillas, and Hugo Lloris as his favourite three goalkeepers, and just getting him to talk a little bit about them in terms of their strengths, in terms of areas he really when he thought about them, when he pictured them, what they were doing, how they were doing it, getting him to really think about the granular detail as best as he possibly could with the age that he's at and the limited English that he has. Was just really interesting, and I think when people are able just to sit back, picture that, it can really get them to think about the granular detail of movement, decision making, fine motor skills, and so on and so forth. It's an area that I don't think we promote enough in sports psychology as valuable to discourse and uncovering solutions and brainstorming problems and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we look at the wider picture and we look at the end product. We don't actually look at the process that goes into that. And that was, again, nice for my PhD. And again, I use this in soccer. We break down the learning. So, from an imitation perspective, how do we observe that action? How do we then process it, put it into a motor plan? How do we then plan that action? How do we then execute? How do we then get, the sensory motor feedback, the auditory visual feedback? How do we then process that ready for the next attempt, right? And I think and that's what I did within my PhD, is utilize that imitation model to almost break down each stage and really try to understand it. What was really nice in my PhD was it allowed us to open up certain avenues. So I had a follow-up, one of my PhD students, Dan Klaus, who's at Birmingham City University at the moment, and he sort of explored the idea around planning and whether planning was different in autistic individuals to neurotypicals. And it was and then follow on was Nathan Foster, who's out in Germany now. He did his PhD just after me, and he looked at sensory motor processing. So it's great just to break that down and really get into the as you said, like the granular detail around imitation and really explore it. So not just to say, okay, imitation's not functioning in autistic individuals, or, if we're talking in a sport context, if we're just saying, okay, they can't copy what I'm trying to do, they can't execute. Okay, where in that process might there be difficulties? Because it might only be one, right? So it's just nice to be able to look at it in that granular detail and see how it builds up into that bigger picture of skill acquisition.
Well, interesting for me and for everybody listening in. If you'd like to learn more about some of the stuff that we're talking about here, some of your colleagues, Matthew, were on the show, episode 212. Dr. Matthew Scott, Professor Paul Holmes, and Dr. David Wright talking about exploring the use of motor imagery in sport. I'm assuming you have day-to-day interaction with them.
I do, yeah. And so they've got other colleagues. Ben Marshall is one who does a lot of stuff in imagery. Yeah, it's great to see that.
Big department. Well, that was episode 212, so please do tune into that. But today, we're going to unpack a paper that you led recently. The paper is entitled Talent Development in Female Soccer, Developmental Activities of Professional Players in England. Now, you led this paper. You were ably assisted by Professor Paul Ford, as you've mentioned earlier, but also Sam Alder, Francesca Champ, Thomas Brownlee, Naomi Datson, and Joe Causa. So some fantastic names there. I'd love to get a bit of background to this paper. A few things to highlight. This is about talent development. This is in female soccer, and this is exploring the developmental activities of professional players. So perhaps here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the difference in activities that professional players engage in as compared to players who didn't make it through to the professional level. However, you're the expert, passing it over to you. Give us a bit of background with relation to this paper.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So yeah, the first thing I would say is the reason it all started was, I think I've said this before we jumped on the pod, is so I'm a girl dad. I've got two daughters who are football, soccer mad.
How old are they?
They are 11 and 4.
Okay.
So when I started this particular paper, there's only the one, and she was around 6, 7. And as I said, I started looking at skill acquisition, taking over from Paul's work. And I was asked once, I can't recall exactly, but she basically said, is there any research in women's football? And so I just looked and I was like, actually, there's not. And it was, it was a bit very, very limited stuff out there and nothing in particular in this area. There was an odd paper there, here and there, but very, very limited. So I was like, this, I'd like to do something in this. It started off more of a passion thing, but then slowly as I started looking into this, it was really, really, really interesting. So there was a paper published by Curran in 2019, which looked at talent identification development in women's sports in general. And it was shown that only 10% of studies published in talent identification development just in sport were in female-only populations. So, very, very low. Another paper by quite a large group published in Science and Medicine in Football, led by Catherine Holgum Krieger. I apologise if I get her name wrong, but she published a paper with quite a lot of colleagues looking at a scope and review of women's soccer. And you could see that gradually over time, over the last sort of 10, 15 years or so, there was more research interest in female soccer, but it's still so low in comparative to the men's game. And when they went down into detail around that, there was very little. A lot of it was around physical side of things, injury, but not too much around this sort of talent ID development area. So that's where I wanted to explore. At the time, Paul published a paper in 2020 in the Journal of Sports Scientists looking at developmental activities of female soccer players from 5 top performing soccer nations. Arnie Gullick had published a paper in 2019 in International and National Female Players in Germany, and David Hendry and colleagues, including Nikki Hodges and Mark Williams, published a paper, and Paul Ford actually, in Canadian national and varsity level players. So there was a little bit out there, but not too much in England. And obviously with the recent rise in participation in youth females and the inclusion of like the Women's Super League in 2011, the fact that, players are now signing professional contracts, that was, full-time professional contracts in 2018 was really interesting. So I really wanted to explore this area and sort of look and say, okay, what do their pathways look like? And one of the main drivers for me was a comment that I picked up by a paper by Stacey Emmons, who's a really good researcher in this area, more around the physical side of things, was that, there are differences in biological maturation, also biopsychosocial between boys and girls. And therefore it makes a lot of the literature from the men's or the boys' game hard to translate over to the female. So for me, it was like, we need to then address this, see if the pathways are the same. If they are, great, we can utilize some of the boys' literature. So again, like some of Paul's work in 2012 around, the boys' game could do that. And I've done some stuff in CONCACAF nations. So it was something we could explore within the women's game. So we did that. So we utilized the participant history questionnaire to be able to understand that. Had a few bumps along the road. So we gained ethical approval in summer 2019, started out with all the best intentions, and then COVID hit. So it kind of halted and delayed data collection, but we managed to get through. So we ended up collecting, in total, we collected quite a few, but what I really wanted to look at was more the players in England. So the players who were born and spent their formative years in England, because Paul's study is one of the most comprehensive in this particular area, and we can get onto this later, but the differences in the pathways for let alone boys and girls, but for the different countries, made it really difficult to really cement why these things were occurring. And so for me, I really want to look at one nation, obviously England being this is where we are, and then we can hopefully directly attribute the talent development systems to the pathways that the players have had. So that was the main rationale behind that.
Okay. So there were players in England. How big was the sample?
So we had 56 players complete the survey. So it was 28 for the professional players and 28 for the ex-academy players. We went to 10 of the 12 teams that were competing. So I said it was 2020, 2021 season. We went to 10 of the 12 Women's Super League teams to ask if they would like to participate. Obviously, because of the time, a lot would have loved to, just didn't have the time. And, it's quite difficult because everything was on hold. Everyone obviously wanted to do surveys because that's all we had access to at that time. So we could either do anything that was like non-player facing. So it was either interviews or it was surveys. I'm sure they're getting bombarded. So a lot of them just said, no, we can't. But 7 clubs agreed to allow us to collect participant history questionnaire from the players.
And if I was to look at one of the surveys, what kind of questions would I be confronted with?
Yeah, so it's split into three sections. So the first section asks the players around their milestones. So some of the important things, such as when did they start playing soccer, when they start participating, when did they start engaging in formal practice with a coach, almost like when did they start a team. For this particular survey, we wanted to understand a little bit more about the players and the level, the absolute playing level. So we asked them, did you play youth international? And what age did you make your debut? When did you sign a professional contract? So obviously for the professional players, what type of contract was that? Because that's something that's really interesting. The difference between the boys and the girls is, you don't see, if at all, in the boys' game signing dual contracts where they attend university as a full-time student, but then they're also a full-time athlete.
Okay.
It's typical in the US, but here not so much. So we asked those kind of questions. The second section was all on the activities. So we asked them to retrospectively provide us with the hours of activity per week that they engaged in individual practice led by a coach, competition, and then also peer-led play. So when they were, street soccer, when they're out with their friends with the intention to have fun. So we asked them the hours, but then importantly, what we did was we also tried to get their perceptions of that activity, because that's not something that's been done too much. There's only a handful of papers that have really understood the perceptions of each of these activities. And then the final section was around other sport activity. So Arnie Gullick has shown some really nice work in this area, showing that coach-led practice, in a sport-specific coach-led practice, is not something that necessarily differentiates players, but it's actually higher levels of peer-led play and coach-led practice in other sports. So we wanted to understand, okay, what's the contribution to other sports to lead into their expertise. So that's what the survey looks like. Takes anywhere between sort of 45 minutes to 60 minutes to complete. Because of COVID, we did, when things started opening up, we did quite a few things face to face, but a lot of it was over video call. And we essentially just stepped them through. If they had any questions, we could answer them. So it's just a really nice way of gauging their pathways and how they've become from just starting to engage in the sport to some of the highest levels that you can achieve.
So unpack the results for me, and feel free to build in your own thoughts about what you found, what you uncovered, what these results mean for clubs, academies, coaches out there.
Yeah, no problem. So to give a detailed synopsis as I can, so what we found was, overall the professional players, those that went on to sign a professional contract, they engaged in almost double the amount of hours in soccer specific activities compared to those that didn't make it. One of the big differentiators was the amount of engagement in childhood. So we define childhood as between when they start. So they typically started around 5-6 years of age. Those that went on to gain a professional contract, they engaged in 3 times the amount of hours in peer-led play and 2 times the amount of hours in practice that was led by a coach. So that was one of the main differences that we found. They joined an academy, an elite academy, around 13, 14 years of age. Due to that, play for both of them decreased, practice increased. You'll see that the competition gradually increases. A lot of that is because they're engaging in more games, but then also the format of the games are increasing. So obviously going from 60-minute to 90-minute games, for example. And obviously because they're getting better, they're going further in competitions, etc. So that was quite natural. What was interesting was that in early adolescence, the professional players engaged in around 550 hours of practice, whereas the ex academy, it was only around 300. And in late adolescence, so early adolescence is from 13 to 15, and then from 16 to 18, when they typically made their debut. For the first team, senior team, the professionals engaged in around 800 hours of practice, whereas the ex academy was only around 450. And because of the nature of the survey and keeping anonymity, we didn't know which academies these players were attached to. And therefore, what we didn't know is how much provision the coaches were providing. So that could be something that was differentiating. The ex academy could have been ex academy players could have been at elite training academies where the coaches could maybe only provide one session per week, whereas those that went on to professional, it could be that they are providing two practice sessions a week. So that could be one of the main reasons. There was a slight early engagement from the professional players, so they started playing around a year earlier. So that would have had a little bit of a difference, but it wouldn't have made, when we're talking treble and double the hours, it wouldn't have made a difference between the ages of 5 and 18, right? So it was very interesting. And one thing I'd just like to add is that these players were 24 years of age at the time of data collection, so it's 28 something now. But at that time, there's been a lot of changes, particularly in England, around the investment of women's soccer. We talked about just at the start, FIFA put in $1 billion between 2020 and 2022 in women's soccer. But then particularly around England, which is why it interests me, was that in 2018, they created the Women's Super League Academy structure, which was interesting. And then in 2020, they created the Lionesses pathway for trying to look to with the aim to create national team players. So what we did was we looked at one of my PhD students and a co-author of this particular paper, Sam Alder. He looked at using the participant history questionnaire and put that into current academy players. So this was a couple of years ago. So they'll be, we're talking another 8 years difference. And I'm sure if we did this in another few years and we did, it would change. But in terms of those hours, you can see the patterns are very similar, but the hours have increased because the players we took were from Tier 1 Women's Super League academies, and therefore the provision has got higher. I think the other thing that's really interesting and something that's not been investigated too much, and something I'd like to look at, is around the concept of mixed gender soccer. So again, in the boys' game, very unlikely that they would play in mixed gender teams, whereas for females, it's something that almost they had to do. So you see around between 60 and 80% of the players from this study engaged either in mixed gender soccer, so a mix of boys and girls, or they were the only girl on the boys' team. So they had to do that because there just wasn't those opportunities around. And as I said, it's interesting that Sam's done a follow-up to this as part of his PhD, and things are changing. So it's just really interesting in terms of some of the main takeaways. And I guess the final point, which was really interesting, was that the ex academy players, they found practice and competition, both physically and cognitively, more demanding than the professional players. And we obviously, again, because we don't know the players, it's hard to speak on their behalf. But what maybe could be happening is that they don't possess the necessary skills to progress, and therefore the practice that they're engaging in is just too difficult. Or, and obviously we don't know, so I'm only speculating here, and this is just more anecdotal than anything.
Yeah.
Is that the coaches are providing sessions that don't meet the players' demands. So maybe they're putting on sessions that are too difficult, or they're not allowing them to develop. So it's hard to say, and we tried to answer some of those questions. With again, Sam Alder's done a follow-up study where he's looked at the microstructure of practice and how that looks. So, yeah, I guess that's an overview of the study. Hopefully, it was, if anyone's read it, they found it insightful.
I suppose my next question to you is, you are a parent to two soccer mad girls, as you've mentioned. Well, what does this mean to you? What are your takeaways here for them? What are because immediately my mind is abuzz in terms of this feels contradictory is the wrong word, but let's go with this. Challenged by this notion of early specialization and the evils of early specialization, or the arguments against early specialization, because it sounds to me, at a guess, that the players who went on to play professionally, and obviously the caveat here is not everybody wants to go on and play professional soccer. I understand and appreciate and respect that.
Yeah, of course.
And that's probably not the healthiest way to look at it. But those who did practiced more, double the amount, which I think is a very interesting or a surprising amount more. And I remember speaking with Mark Williams on the Sports Psych show, and him saying something similar here, is that the players who go on to make it, if you want to describe it that way, are the ones who practice more early. They accumulate more hours. So there feels like a tension here with this idea of the evils of early specialization, not necessarily the adultification or the professionalization of youth football, because I think that's something slightly different. But there's only so many hours in a day, and young people have school, they have lives outside of school and their sport. So I would be interested to get your thoughts here, and interested to get your thoughts from the perspective of, I'm a dad, my children would love to excel in soccer. So what does this mean to you as their dad, and also what this means to you as an academic in this area? What conversations are you having with the wider world about this?
Yeah, it's interesting that the in terms of early specialization started in almost like 93, right, with the legend Ericsson. I guess with this particular study, it lends itself slightly towards the early engagement hypothesis that Paul Ford posited in 2009. And the reason I say that, whether it is they do practice a lot. What we try to do is try to delve into the components of each of these activities and try and get an understanding of, in terms of the deliberate practice theory. So if we think about, the deliberate practice theory, it's high in effort, it's high in relevance, it's low in engagement. However, I know like Ed Coughlin, for example, has published a few studies, 2019, that disputed that a little bit. But it's also high in motivation. And what we did see was they actually, they're engaging in high levels of practice, but when we match that to their perceptions of practice, it was really high. So you're looking at like 4.1, 4.2 out of 5 when we put it on a Likert scale, right? So they're averaging high. So yes, they're engaging in practice. They're finding it cognitively and physically demanding. However, they're really enjoying it at the same time, and they're finding it really motivating. So I think that's one element of it. So I think and I'll get into the microstructure in a second, but I think the other component is they were engaging a lot of play. They were engaging in more play than they were practice. So yes, it's higher than X Academy, but one thing to caveat the study is that a third of the players at the 28 had played internationally. But when you compare them towards, say, the Arne Gullick's paper in national players in Germany, Henry's in Canada, and Paul, they weren't engaging as much practice. So, they were slightly lower. But in terms of that relationship between practice and play, they're engaging a lot more play than they were practice. And so that was really interesting for me in terms of, I always say to my girls, like, they want them to practice, I want them to get better, but also I want them to enjoy it. So like when they come off from training, I I just stand to the side. I don't say anything, because I'd hate to be that parent who, says, "Oh, I'm an expert in this area. I could help." I just want them to have fun. So the first thing I ask them when they come off the field is, "Did you enjoy that?" And it doesn't matter, if they're playing games, they're practicing. The first thing I say is, "Did you have fun? Did you enjoy it?" Because a childhood, that's what I want for them. So yeah, I think that was one of the interesting components. One thing that is we just didn't have the opportunity to be able to explore is actually the microstructure of that practice and what it's made up of. So I know that Arnie Gullick did this in his 2019 paper, is he actually asked the breakdown of it, how much time, and what he found is actually a discriminator between international level players, so those who went on to represent the German national team, and domestic level players, is the time when they were practicing, how much of that proportion was in what we call like games-based activities. So where it replicates the demands of the game rather than like drills, fitness. And it was around 40-50%. And interestingly, with Sam Alder's work, so it's not with the same players, but it is with academy players. So we ran a microstructure of practice, and what we found is only 0.25% of the time these are youth academy players, right? Tier 1, so they're very, very good players, very good coaches. They only spent around 24-25% of time in drills, whereas they spent around 55. So it's similar to Arnie Gullick's paper. They spent around 55% of time in games. And we know with kids, they love to play games, so they're getting that enjoyment. But then just linking it back to like the deliberate practice theory is that, if it's more game-like and it's more related, I know Nicky Hodges did some of this in the mid-90s, is if it's more related to the game, you get higher levels of enjoyment. So I think that's where it kind of comes away. I would say that, you've got the deliberate, early specialization, early engagement, early diversification, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later if we have the opportunity, but those three dictonomous patterns, it's quite difficult to explain the pathways of different sports, different genders, different countries with three pathways. And, one of the things which I didn't mention earlier was that we saw a lot of players have lots of inter-individual variation. And it just to show that, okay, we're classifying these players as a homogenous group, i.e. they went on and played professionally and played in the Women's Super League. However, the variation was really wide. So it accounted for the professional players, around 70 to 75% of players had some form of variation where they were different from the rest of the group. So it just shows you that we know this anyway in talent ID and development, that it's not a linear process, but it just shows you that their pathways are very different in this. So I guess that would be my answer to that, around kind of early specialization, just to provide a bit more detail and a bit more context around the pathways. And not all hours in practice are equal, and therefore we need to understand that a little bit more.
So my question there, just to check my own understanding, when you say there's differences in variability, that each individual got to where they got to in different ways by and large. There's not a general model there. There's some general assumptions that we're making here, but each individual had variation in terms of their experiences that contributed to where they've got to.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the things they had in common was that they started to engage in soccer around 5-6 years of age. They joined a youth academy around 14 years of age.
Yep.
They made their debut sort of late 17 to early 18 years of age and subsequently signed a contract. Those kind of things were similar in terms of those time points.
And they did more. They all did more. They engaged in the sport more, and they had game-based experiences as well. Are those parts of the commonalities?
Yeah, I mean, that's where they start to differ. So some of the variations, just to give context. So the questions we looked at when we looked at their data was, did they engage in more hours in other sports compared to soccer? So then you think like Arnie Gullick's work, a bit like early diversification as well. Or were the other sport hours equal to soccer specific hours? We looked at whether they engaged in relatively low level of other sports, so whether soccer was their only sport or they engaged in another sport for a very small period of time? Was the engagement in soccer-specific play greater than practice? Did they engage in no soccer-specific play? So, like, did they just engage in practice? Was there competition, the amount of time they spent in competition per week, actually greater than the amount of time they practiced? So, like, were they practicing for only an hour, but then they were playing, 90-minute game, possibly, twice over a weekend? And also, was there less than 1 hour per week? We saw relatively low hours. So within that, you had 70 to 75% of the players, this was across both groups, by the way, were engaging in activities that were different from the rest of the group. So yeah, I mean, the timelines look a little bit similar, but when you start, again, like granular detail, you can start to see the variation. And what's really interesting is this is all in one country. These are players who were born, spent their formative years in England and play in a women's Super League. So it's really interesting to show that each of those pathways are not alike.
Well, it's fascinating stuff, and I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier. Actually, one of your colleagues, Sam Alder, you mentioned that his work has looked at some of the granular detail related to some of the points that you're making here. Can you speak a little bit to that as well, please?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so I guess just on our previous comments there around saying that the pathways aren't different, so we don't treat all hours in practice as the same, and that's couldn't be more true. I mean, the couple of things that are different is obviously the intensity of each of the sessions. We talked a little bit there about the structure of the sessions, but then we're being absolute, saying you've spent 1 hour in practice or 2 hours in practice. However, when we started to look at some of the practice sessions, actually, around 20% of every practice session is actually taken up in transition. So this could be moving from one activity to the other. It could be a drinks break, something like that. So actually, we say, okay, these players are training for 120 minutes. No, actually, it's more like 100. And then some of Sam's work, which was really nice, and we looked at, and again, it's a Tier 1 Women's Super League Academy, was, okay, so you've got 80% where they're engaging in practice, but then around 75 to 80% of that, the ball's moving. So again, from that time, there's 25% that is lost, because obviously coaches aren't going to be giving instructions and feedback as the ball's moving all the time. They do have to stop the session to explain the next thing. So, we want to look at it from a microstructure level, and that's exactly what we did. And we found some really interesting insights. Some of the previous studies that we published, 2021 was one of them, and some of, again, Paul Forward, Mark Williams' work looked at the microstructure of practice. They actually found that around 60% was in drills and 40% was in games-based activities. And the reason that's important is that drills are relatively isolated. They don't really they develop your technical skills, but they don't really allow for you to develop those perceptual cognitive skills. And I'm sure Mark talked about it quite a lot in his pod. I'd be surprised if he didn't. I'd be surprised if he didn't.
Yep.
And so they were providing limited opportunities for their players to scan the environment, anticipate, make a decision. So what we did in 21 was we through a co-created educational workshop with a Category 1 boys academy, we actually got the coaches to change. We actually flipped it around where it was 60 games based, 40 drill based, which is really nice. And what we did with the women's academy was we want to say, okay, what are they doing? Because these coaches, again, we can't just presume, okay, they're probably doing 40% in one area and 60 in the other. That's not going to happen. So we need to look at this, and that's exactly what we did. And so we actually found it was already, high. So the games base was 50 to 55 in games based, and only 25% in drill. So that was really nice. So again, it's just exploring and getting an understanding of what's currently going on in the women's game. And as I said, it needs to happen. We can't just extrapolate information for the boys and just lend it over to the girls, because it just might not be the case. So yeah.
Talking about context, there's so many people listening in from all corners of the globe, but obviously many in America. I know that you've done some work, or there is some work that's been done in America along similar lines. Can you tell us about any kind of cross-country or cultural differences in this area, just to finish us off
Yeah,
here?
no, thanks for the opportunity to chat. Yeah, so my work has naturally led to overseas, and I was really fortunate to work with Morel van Rybok, who was at the time director of talent ID for the girls youth national team. So we started working a couple of years around talent ID and talent development within the female game in the United States. And one of the things I found most fascinating was just how different the two contexts are. So I guess just to give a little bit of more information. So one of the key differences, and it's almost how some of the work that I've done, some of it is relatable to the United States, but some of it isn't. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of the players in the Women's Super League, they made their debut at 18, whereas typically in the US at 18, a youth player won't go into the National Women's Super League. They'll go to college, and from years 18 to 22, they'll be in college. So they're almost in like a holding pattern, and then they get put into a draft system, which is obviously unfamiliar to people in the UK. So that's one of the big things. I think the other thing is that some of the talk I'd say about the microstructure of practice and working with Tier 1 Women's Super League academies, they're starting to develop slowly, but they don't. So like, for example, the San Diego Wave, teams like that, they don't have a full youth structure. So whereas, you could get, again, I use my own personal example, one of my daughters could join an elite academy, a Women's Super League academy, say 10, 11 years of age. They could go all the way through, sign a professional contract, and then play senior football, all in the same team. In the US, very different. At sort of U12, U13, they'll start to play more national competitions. And obviously those national competitions take a large distance. The US is 40 times larger than the UK. So, some teams, just to fulfill their regular season games, will travel 4 or 5 states, so they'll do that. Then they can move and they can play across multiple platforms. So you've got the ECNL, GA League, things like that. And then, they'll go into college and then the pro game. So there's one of the differences. The other difference is the pay to play system. And look, I'm not saying any of these are right or wrong in terms of which one is better. What I am saying is those environmental factors really need to be understood. And I think cross country comparisons are really important, but almost we need to understand each individual soccer association and where they share those similarities, but also where they're different, so we can learn from those. So that's kind of some of the stuff that we're doing. So the first place we started with the birth date. So we looked at relative age effect across the talent identification process. So we looked at youth players. So they were U13 to U18, 19, and they were club level players. So they'd been identified but not invited to a regional talent camp. Those players that had been invited to a regional talent camp, and then the final group of players was actually youth national team players. And we saw there was a relative age effect at club, but this gradually decreased. So it's really nice to see this kind of understanding of the environment of US soccer within the birth date. We're looking at some stuff around birthplace effect and just almost getting people to understand what is the environment like within the US. And I've got to be honest, I'm not an expert in the slightest, but every time I go over and every time I see new things, I gradually learn more. But I think, again, if we just put that data across, it's not applicable. So it's really important. So yeah, it's exciting stuff to work with two different high performing nations.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Matthew, absolutely fascinating conversation. I mean, it's such a complex area to understand and unpack, and I know this work that you're doing is going to help so many coaches better understand and better make sense of this area. With that in mind, I know you will have tapped the interest of very many listening in. So, how can people find you, follow you, and potentially get in contact?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to chat to anybody around this area. So yeah, I mean, Twitter, X, it's at Matthew with 2 T's, Andrew 23. LinkedIn, check that regularly, and then via email. So it's matthew.andrew@mmu.ac.uk. But yeah, I'd be more than happy to chat to anybody interested, provide some data, just have a general catch up about women's soccer, talent ID and development. Be great.
Matthew, thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.